is up, guys? I'm going to be making this video just as a precaution. I don't consider myself a professional anymore. I'm somebody who's very enthusiastic about this stuff, and tuning's awesome. And yeah, so this video is going to be on how to make an ignition table from scratch, and this pretty much applies to all different ECUs, whether you're on a mega squirt, a micro squirt, link, or said platform. Um, so there's that. Um, and this is particularly for a turbo rotary setup because it seems to be that there's a lot of confusion in terms of how to go about doing this. So again, I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any means, or a pro, but I have yet to blow up a motor from all the cars I've tuned. Um, and I'll kind of talk about uh, which timing is more ideal for your setup, for example, and what's safe, and you know, uh, things like that. So here, this is like a micro squirt base tune. This is kind of the most affordable ECU on the market. Um, and if you guys don't know what a micro squirt is, for example, I'll just show you. Um, so obviously DIY Auto Tune, you can buy it from DIY Auto Tune. It's a pretty affordable ECU and pretty easy to wire up. One of the drawbacks is limited I/O, so you can't have like a bunch of things like a fuel pressure sensor or oil pressure sensor to incorporate different safeties. Maximum you can only run one I/O. Outside of that, if you have like an IAC, you can only run like fan control, or you got to sacrifice that or put this fan controller on a thermal switch, or you could run boost control, which a lot of people do. So, that being said, micro squirt, yeah, awesome. Good ECU for the price, and a lot of fun to tune with. And I actually learned how to tune on the Mega Squirt platform, mainly with Turbo Miatas. So this is a very user-friendly platform to work with. First things first, before you let's say you get your first startup going with some base map from Aaron Cake, for example, and I'll actually provide a file of this base map if you guys want it. You get your car started somehow. Realistically, the first thing that you want to do is you want to lock base timing. That is so important, and I think a lot of people neglect how important that can be. Uh, so, uh, yeah, you don't want to play around and mess that up. So on an FC, for example, I'm going to put a photo here on the screen. This will pop up. Here we go. So on an FC, there's going to be two timing marks. And what you want to do, for example, in the micro squirt, is you want to click from fixed advance, you want to fix it to a fixed timing, and then you want to set this value, if it lets me, to -5. So that is 5 degrees after top dead center, and then the whole ECU will only be at 5 degrees after top dead center. And then you want to get a timing light and attach it onto leading one, not trailing one, leading one. And when you do so, sorry about that. When you do so, if you see, there's two timing marks on an FC. There's the one to the left and then the one to the right. And it sometimes has a yellow marking, but with how these cards have aged, you'll never see that yellow marking. So if you can, just take the gold Sharpie. I prefer the gold Sharpie because it's very easy to see, and just mark that trailing, my bad. You want to mark the yellow one, so that leading mark. So when you mark it, you put it on a timing light, and then you adjust the crank angle sensor till timing is set. And then once you've done so, and that's all good to go, you can go back to use table, burn to your ECU, and then the most important part of the process has been completed. So, that's done. and your base timing is fully set. So what's next? What is next? So the first thing I like to do, and it gets neglected a lot, let's talk about the rotary split table. I'm gonna zero this out real quick, and if you're just starting out tuning and whatnot, I would just leave this table at 10. Now, what that does is it shoots the trailing, my bad, the trailing spark plugs 10 degrees after the leading plug has been fired. Now, you can actually have it do it the other way, where the trailing spark plug will fire before, and then um, and then the leading will follow. Now, this is ideally for power and then a couple other things. But if one were to want to improve fuel economy, you would actually use a negative value, which is called negative split. And a negative split technically would fire, you know, the trailing plug first and then the leading. This is for conservation of fuel and MPGs and whatever economy. So we're just going to leave this as 10 degrees all around. And if you're in the link ECU, it needs to be negative and then vice versa. So if you have a negative value in the link, it will shoot after. If you have a negative value, the leading will shoot after, and then vice versa. So long story short, leave it at 10 if you're in a Haltech or micro or Haltech micro squirt or mega squirt, and if you're in a link, make this value negative 10. And I actually can't even make it negative 10 here, so that's like even more hilarious. Um, but yeah, now let's get to the ignition table. So I'm gonna get really ballsy here. We're gonna make this whole thing 0. All right, cool. So we're starting from scratch, and what the hell are we going to do? How are we going to do this? So for reference, I have to set the scaling for my axes on my table to what I feel that my setup's going to be at, and how, you know, you guys can figure out how much boost you might run. And this is particularly like this setup is going to be on wastegate pressure, so there's not going to be any boost controller involved or anything. So the boost will be kept pretty low. So with that, if you can see right here on my y-axis, I have all these Kpa values. And for reference, sadly, I remember this stuff off the top of my head. So for the Kpa conversions, at 100 Kpa, that would be like 0 PSI, so absolute pressure. 1 PSI would be 108. 2 PSI would be 115, 3 PSI would be 120, 4 PSI would be 130, 5 PSI would be 135, 6 PSI would be 140, 7 PSI would be 150, 8 PSI would be 155, blah, 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 blah. So these are the conversions relative to absolute with vacuum being pulled. So as you can see in the Mega Squirt / Micro Squirt platform on Tuner Studio, it's actually really nice because it shows you, if you look, 0.0 psi relative to 100 kPa, and as you step up 2.9, roughly 3 psi, and so on and so forth. So the rule of thumb is whenever on a boosted application, you want to pull a degree of timing per each psi. So I actually just made it really simple for you guys to follow. So I have these as 1 psi increments. Pretty much. So we're going to pull a degree of timing as we get higher into the boost levels. So that being said, the first thing I always do is we typically want our timing at idle. So this is typically where our idle cells would be at. Our idle cells would be somewhere around here. We want roughly 15 degrees of timing before it's at dead center. The reason why you don't want to run too much advanced timing, and that's really kind of where I caught it. If you have an idle air control valve, this will help a lot, is what happens if you run too much advanced timing, your EGTs get hot, your coolant temps get hot, your engine gets really hot. As a result, that could do a lot of damage to your engine. So 15 degrees of timing is roughly a pretty safe, sweet spot, and I wouldn't tap out anywhere past there. Maybe even 17 degrees max if you don't have an idle air control valve, but keep it pretty low. So typically my rule of thumb is we start at 15 degrees of timing around here. Now, next up, I'm just going to mention, we're at idle, and then let's get into our cruising cells. Now, since this is a boosted application, it's not going to live most of its life down there, but we have concerns there. So typically on a setup like, let's say my car, for example, around 3,500 is where I find myself cruising at. So, 3,500 to 4 grand. So at 3,500, somewhere around here, this whole section before boost. Typically people when they're cruising, they actually do prefer to run a lot more conservative, a lot more timing advanced. So for example, a stock RX-8 runs roughly 32 degrees before top dead center around cruising to help with fuel economy. So I'll actually just keep it roughly when I do my tables at 30 degrees or so. So now that that's been handled, we're going to do a couple tricky things. You see, we have a couple zeros, so we have some things to fill in right now. So whenever we are stepping up into boost, what I'm actually going to do from these idle cells, and this is just to keep the consistency of the pattern, you most likely may not even find yourself in this area. This is like if you're in the wrong gear going up a hill. So I will pretty much just step it down. So 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, my bad, Oop, 7. All right, coolio. So that's been handled. Now, how are we going to fill in these blanks, you may ask? You want to keep the timing pretty linear or the way the transients are handled. So now that we've figured out what we want to do from here and our cruising, um, this is where, and actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave this as is. As we go into boost, I'm just going to put these values at 0 and you'll understand why I'm doing that. So, uh, we want a way to, uh, and I'm gonna also put this as 30 because it's still under boost. Um, we want a way to uh, fill in these blanks over here. So as we go up in timing, we want to step up all the way to 30. So the way you want to do that is you just want to do a horizontal interpolation. So as you can see here, I did a horizontal interpolation. And then over here, I also want to figure out what am I going to do to fill in these blanks. You probably won't even be around here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to step this up to roughly 32, so 2 degrees past here. So 32, and then we're going to do another horizontal interpolation. And then as you can see, this is roughly kind of where we have our timing at uh, here, and then I can clean this up a little more by just doing a whole entire linearization or smoothing of this whole section. And then as you can see, our idle cells are roughly where we want it to be. Assuming you're able to target for 1,000 RPM idle, most likely you'll be able to achieve that with like EV14 injectors. Now, I want to get into the boost section. So as I said, as you get higher into the boost, you're going to pull a degree of timing for each PSI. So typically on a 6-port turbo at, so this is like at 7 PSI, I would run 12 degrees of timing. Now this is like very controversial. So So what you do is you run 12 degrees and uh, up top, and then you can run more advanced at a lower boost pressures. So let's say I want to run 12 degrees of timing at 7 PSI. I would start at 12, and then as you can see, step down 13, 14, 15, 16. So with that, that gives me a pretty rough idea. Some people, whenever you're doing like a pull, you can actually set this whole thing to 12, but I won't do that, as you can see. So I'll just zero this out. And then, as I said, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So it's, pulling a degree of timing as we go down in the table. And then one thing you can do is you can do a horizontal interpolation throughout this whole section. And then pretty much, one thing I will also love to do after I've done so is just clean up the transients in between here from 100 kPa roughly as we step up into boost. So you could just actually do an entire smoothing of that, and that will clean that up just a little bit. And if you look at our 3D table, we have something pretty clean. So this is a pretty safe timing table that will get us to where we want to be. So relatively, for most people, my bad. This whole section right here under boost might be roughly the same for most people, but you want to figure out how you're going to handle your boost and step it down by a degree. So with that, for tuning a turbo rotary, again, you can start here at 12. And then one thing I've learned is I want to make sure. So for example, if I do a pull and I find where my peak is, so at 5,000 RPM, if I discover that at, you know, uh, this is my peak, maybe I'll run like 12 degrees here and then uh, and then step down. But you most likely might not find yourself here and it's not too aggressive. But if you do feel uncomfortable with those values, um, just to play it safe, you can always just step it down by 1 degree. And, that's still relatively safe. Um, so if you see here too, these are um, cruising areas roughly. So this is like a funny photo that I'm actually going to share with you. This is typically like, your idle cells, and then you're up a hill or in a wrong gear. But realistically, you probably won't find yourself there. This isn't all that accurate. And then you have your wide open throttle and your partial throttle in between 100 and 120. So as you can see, especially in your partial throttle, you want some good linearization between those cells. So you want it to be as consistent in terms of the numbers moving up and down. So as you can see, this is our just a rough timing table. And if you were like on a Turbo 2 setup, you could run a lot more advanced. So like some people could run upwards to 22 to 23 degrees. But since this is a high compression setup that mostly I talk about on my channel, this is typically a pretty safe spot to start your timing at, and just keep the car safe without burning your apex seals and having really hot EGTs from my experience. And then again, with your split table, you can play around with it and you could run like, um, roughly uh, like 12 and 11 and then 10, and your split table would look something like that. But typically, you can just leave it alone and just keep it all the way at 10. Just play it safe. So, if you guys remember, I did talk about a couple things in this video. A, always make sure that your base timing is fully set. And, if you're starting out new, say you're split to 10 degrees, and then try to figure out exactly where you want set up your table the way you want it. So, you know, this is how I set it up. I didn't really play with these. and I just focused more on the boost sections by having increments of 1 PSI and then kept moving up and up and up. And I'll put a little like cheat sheet of uh, the PSI equivalent to Kpa if you want to do that. And yeah, I mean, it's not the prettiest thing, but it's definitely something that'll get you going. And it is pretty safe from my experience. I'm not really going to like comment too much on what other tuners may think. Again, I don't like consider myself like God tier by any means. I just know how to not blow up a car. And, for example, if you're running 9 to 7 rotors, I would typically never run anything more than 7 PSI on a relatively stock setup. So, this timing is pretty safe on a 9 to 7 setup too. If anything, some people just run 10 degrees, so they'll run a degree less up top, and that's pretty safe all around. I could run a lot more timing advanced, but this is just to keep it really conservative and safe. So if you have like a Series 5 or a Series 4 rotor setup, this is relatively some good timing at roughly 7 PSI. So from my personal experience, um, the way my like rule of thumb, um, if if that makes sense, um, how can I word this? It's like so weird to word when it comes to this, and like I don't want to like spread false information. So like again, everything I say is just roughly from experience rather than just me talking out of my butt. But you could run upwards to 14, 16 degrees at 7 psi, and then, at 10 psi, roughly 14 degrees, and then 14 psi, you could run 13, and 19 psi, you could run 12 degrees. And then at 20 psi, you could run 10 degrees on a Series 4 setup. And then if I was on a Series 5 setup, I would step that down roughly by 4 degrees, if anything, from those values, and then start from there. So you always just want to start with a peak value whenever you're making your ignition table, or you have an idea of roughly where you want to be. And then also just remember when you're just starting out tuning, please don't put on any boost control stuff. Make sure your boost control is off. You don't want to do any of that until you've dialed in your fueling and then your ignition. And then, once you have a timing table to work with, the next thing that you always want to do is just work on cleaning up your fueling and getting your AFRs right. So, you know, this is just a rough AFR. These numbers mean nothing to you because they're different on every car. So like this is what AFR targets would look like too, 13.5 around idle, 14 around cruising, and then you know, one thing I always want to mention is, um, Jesus Christ, my rule, what I like to do is I like to run 13.5 roughly at idle, 13.0 to 13.5 roughly at idle. And then during cruising, I like to run 14.0 to 14.5. And then from 0 to 5 PSI, typically I like to run 12 AFR, and then anywhere past that, 11 to 1. So that keeps it pretty safe. Um, and yeah, and then lastly, whenever you're tuning for fueling, you always want to make sure that you have closed loop fuel disabled. So that would be like ego control. And then you typically just want to keep that disabled um, while you're tuning, and then you can enable that back when you're done. Because what that will do is it'll allow you to make changes to your field table, and then this is, if you look here, single wideband. Um, it'll adjust like for fueling with that AFR table. So underneath cruising, you'll get pretty decent AFRs and gas mileage with having a wideband hooked up to it. So overall, hopefully this was very helpful. And if you guys want to see more of these videos or informational videos, like with tuning or just me learning tuning too. I want to do a live session of me street tuning my car when I get it up and going. Feel free to comment down, and if you guys have any other ideas or things you want to see, just let me know. And yeah, take it easy, guys.